Hello everyone and welcome back to the Chess24 Legends of Chess tournament with the most anticipated match of the event, Magnus Carlsen, world champion versus Vasyl Ivanchuk, every world champion's worst nightmare. As Kasparov once said, you never know which Chucky will show up, the one where he just, tumbles around and, moves pieces, or the one who is unstoppable and will crush you. So always an interesting matchup. It's Magnus with the white pieces. This is game one and already quite a thriller. So let's check it out. And if you're wondering about the title, it's something Rustam Kasimjanov said during the live coverage, that these two control 800% of all the chess talent in the world. That doesn't really make sense, but he just wanted, I guess he just wanted to make it sound that that both of them are incredibly, talented. So let's check it out. Magnus with the white pieces opens with d4. We have knight to f6, c4, we have e6, knight to f3, and the bishop to b4 with check. Vasyl goes for the Bogo-Indian defense, and also it's something that a lot of people say when playing against Ivanchuk, it's best not to prepare, as he plays absolutely everything and it makes no sense to prepare for him. Best to just take a nice walk before the game or the match. So bishop d2 is the most common reply here. Magnus goes for knight b to d2, the Gruenfeld variation of the Bogo-Indian. We have castles and a3 now, asking the bishop to either capture the knight or to move away. So bishop to e7 and now e4. Magnus grabs the center. We have d6 and now bishop to e2. We have knight f to d7. And here, Magnus, all of his pieces are very nicely coordinated, except this knight here. So he just brings it back to b1. He wants to shift it back to c3, from where it will be developed to a natural square. We have d5, and now knight to c3. Just continuing development, captures, and now there is one game in the database where b6 was played, but here we have knight back to f6, again, just challenging this knight. And it is, as of move 10, that we have a completely new game. So let's see how Magnus deals with it. We have queen to c2, developing while defending the knight on e4, knight b to d7 now, and knight e to g5. And now there's already a lot of pressure here. If this knight moves, queen captures on h7 will be checkmate. So you have to be very careful what you do here. We have c5 by Chucky. And now bishop to e3. Just continuing development, still not deciding whether to castle queenside or kingside. And here, Vasyl took some 2.5 minutes to decide what to do on his next move, and he decided for queen to a5 check. He basically wants to play queen to c7, but this way, with playing queen to a5, he could maybe get Magnus to move back his bishop and then play queen to c7, resulting in this bishop now being developed to a lesser square, for example. Also, there is the possibility after this queen a5 check to just go b4, let's say, and after captures bishop d2, but that requires too much calculation, and it could be not all that great. So instead, after queen a5 check, Magnus just goes king to f1, basically saying that I'm not interested in castling, I just want to attack on the king side. And seeing a move like this usually means that if you play something like h6, h4 is definitely coming, because this knight can never be captured. If you capture, then again this knight falls, as there will again be checkmate on h7 if it moves. So it's not really a piece sacrifice. So after king f1, we have queen back to c7, and now rook to d1. And here the situation on the clock is 8 minutes Magnus, 6 minutes for Chucky. And what do you do here? You could do a lot of things, but b6 is the most natural developing move. You want to place the bishop to this long diagonal and bring the rook into the game. So here we have knight to e5 by Magnus, a very interesting pawn sacrifice. You could also just push d5, for example, and get a nice pass the d pawn, but for some reason Magnus doesn't like this. Instead, Magnus went for knight to e5, and this is the beginning of well, just a very straightforward attack on Black's king side. So here it's a pawn sacrifice, and Vasyl accepts the challenge. Knight captures, pawn captures, queen captures, and now bishop to f3, challenging the rook here. We have rook to b8, and now the immediate h4. Maybe g3 and then h4, as it also just threatens to pick up the queen, but Black can just always go back, and if bishop f4, e5 is extremely strong here. So Magnus completely disregards this. He goes h4. He wants to play now rook h3 to g3 and bring another attacker into the game. So queen back to c7. Now you don't have to worry about stuff like that, and you can also start with e5. Maybe this bishop can now also be used on this diagonal. rook h3, and now just bishop to b7 instead, going after this light square bishop. Here we have rook to e1 by Magnus, and now rook b to d8. And here, black is doing very well. White is the one who's attacking, but black is up a pawn, and his position is great. However, the problem for Vasyl is that he has only 1.5 minutes on the clock, and Magnus has 5 minutes. But okay, you do get a 10-second increment for every move you make. So here we have bishop captures on b7 by Magnus, queen captures, and bishop back to d2. Now Magnus wants to shift the bishop over to this diagonal to help out with the attack on the black king. The rook is coming to g3 and so on. So h6 challenging this knight, and just bishop to c3. Again, the knight is off limits, since again you will pick up the knight on f6, and then you are also probably getting checkmated. So after this bishop to c3 move, we have rook f to e8, just making room for the king if needed, and now king to g1, getting the king to a safer square. And here the problem is Magnus probably didn't want to play king to g1. He spent a lot of time here. He was up on the clock a lot, and here he spent like 4 minutes, even more than 4 minutes, and he caught up to Chucky on time. Problem is, he probably wanted to play knight captures on f7. It's really a complicated move, but I don't think it was enough time to calculate. Or maybe he was able to calculate that it doesn't give him all that much. Point is that after king captures and rook g3, you want to go here and deliver checkmate. So rook g8 defends this. Now queen g6 check, king to f8, and now let's say you go after this e6 pawn. It's impossible to, probably calculate this all the way. For example, rook d1 check, the king has to come into the game, and now rook d6 adds more defense to the f6 knight. And now let's say if rook captures, bishop captures, and now bishop captures on f6. Problem is black doesn't capture here, but rather captures the rook. And now you don't have anything. Captures, and captures, followed by rook f7 blocking. Black is up a whole rook, and without much issues. So this is what Carlsen was calculating, and he spent almost all of his time here. So in the end, he went king to g1, but still, he is better on time. And now rook d7. Now black just wants to double up here on the d file. Knight back to f3. Now shifting the knight over to e5 as the rook is on d7, and bishop to d6, awaiting knight e5 and preparing to capture. So Magnus goes for it, and bishop captures on e5. We have bishop captures, that's not a bishop, and rook e to d8. Now doubling up on the d file could be very dangerous. And here, just bishop back to c3. Magnus doesn't like to open up the g file. Even with rook g3, the king can just move, and it's not a problem. There is no good way to continue the attack, and black's attack is coming much sooner. So instead, Magnus keeps the bishop to c3. It is much stronger than this knight, so you do want to keep it in the game. And now queen back to c7, hoping to get the queen over to f4 to basically activate the queen. So queen c1, Magnus defends this, and now by playing queen to c1, Magnus allowed a really beautiful move, which I didn't think Vasyl would play it, as he had like 10 seconds on the clock here. And he found it. He played knight to e4, and with this knight to e4 move, what he did is that he ensures the elimination of the dark square bishop. And with this dark square bishop out of the way, Magnus really doesn't have any compensation for the sacrificed pawn. And of course, you cannot go for the rook, because just rook d1 check wins the queen, and that's just game. Or even rather, you can't even capture here, because, well, the queen covers this, it would be checkmate. So you have to play something like rook to e1, and then just rook captures on c1, and gets the job done. So after this knight to e4, we have rook to f3 by Magnus, and now knight captures on c3. Queen captures on c3, and now rook d4. Without the presence of this dark square bishop on this diagonal, the rooks are now free to roam the board. So rook d4 now completely pretty much blocks the queen out of the game. g3, and now rook 8 to d7, just getting the rook to a much more active square, keeping control of f7, and so on. Next to get activated is the queen. So b3 by Magnus, defending the c4 pawn, so the queen can now move, and the queen to c6 now, pressuring the rook here. Rook f to e3, and now a5, with a4 by Magnus, and the queen to d6 now. Now, black might decide to trade off some of the rooks. We have queen to c2, and now queen to c6. Here, both black and white are making some very safe moves to get that 10-second increment on the clock, as they want to get up to a minute and something so they can start creating some plans. So here we have queen e2, and we have rook 7 to d6, queen to h5 by Magnus, and now queen to d7. The Alekhin's gun is now activated. We have queen back to f3 and queen to d8. So again, just making little moves to gain time. King h2 and now rook to d2. We have rook 1 to e2 by Magnus. He doesn't want to allow this rook to come to b2 and then the other rook to land on d2. And here black manages to trade off a pair of rooks. So queen captures. And now rook to d2. Now, putting pressure on the queen, on the f2 pawn, rook to b3 will be an idea at some point. So queen e1, and now h5, just grabbing more space. At some point you want to activate the king and start pushing those central pawns. So rook to f3, and now g6. We have queen to e4, activating the queen. Also, instead of this g6, queen to d4 was also a possibility to grab hold of this important central square, put pressure on f2. This way, by playing g6, Magnus activates his queen on a very nice central square. But rook d4, Vasyl immediately kicks it away. Queen b7, and now rook to d7, pushing the queen back. Queen to c6, and now king g7. We have king to g2, and now rook to d6, pushing the queen back. We have queen to b7, and now queen d7. Black offers a queen trade, and white should not trade. Black has too many weaknesses, and it's only black is only down one pawn, which usually you can hold in a king and rook endgame, but here Magnus does not like his chances. There's the b3 pawn is extremely weak, and once you start pushing these pawns, it's just going to be very, very hard to hold. So queen back to e4, and now f6. f6 has been played. Next is coming e5, f5, and so on. So rook to e3, putting pressure on the e6 pawn, and now just e5. We have king h2 by Magnus, and now comes rook to d2. Queen to f5 was also very interesting here, as it forces a queen trade since the f2 pawn is under attack. But Vasyl decides to leave the queens on the board. For now, he plays rook here, attacks the pawn, and prepares maybe rook b2 to go after the b3 pawn. So rook e2 blocking, and now rook back to d4. We have queen to a8, and now rook to d3. Now the b3 pawn is under attack, and Magnus is forced into passivity with rook to b2. You could also play rook to e3, but it's hard to say. Do you want to make 3 pawn islands, or maybe it's hard to say. So Magnus instead goes rook to b2, defends the b3 pawn this way, but now f5. Now with the rook out of the way, you are free to expand at will here. Queen to b8, putting pressure on the e5 pawn, and now just queen d6, defending while also offering a queen trade. So queen b7 with check, king h6, and now queen to c8, hoping to get some queen to h8 checkmate action going on, as the pawn here covers the g5 square, so you have to be very careful. Vasyl blocks this with queen to f6, and now comes queen to c7. Just playing something, not much to go for here. And now f4. Problem is that next this is coming, and the rook will be under attack. So Magnus immediately moves the rook to e2. Now with a double attack on the pawn here, but now captures with check. F captures, and now e4. Saying you cannot capture this pawn, and e3 is coming, because if you do, well, then just rook d2 check, followed by a nice queen to f1 checkmate. The pawn covers the g4 square. So instead we have queen to b8, again keeping an eye on this square, hoping that Chucky moves the queen, so he can deliver checkmate. But now rook captures on b3. Rook here was also an option, followed by rook f2 check, but Vasyl says we're just gonna capture this and maybe then go for something like this. So queen to e8 now, going after the rook, and here we have this e3 move by black. There was also the extremely interesting rook captures on g3. Point is that the rook cannot be captured because this check forces the king to the second rank, and after this is captured with check, and you have all the time in the world to win the game with black, as white will not get his chance to deliver checkmate. But instead we have e3, and now comes king to g2. So Magnus gets the king to a little bit of a safer square, and now rook to c3. Here it's not clear how to continue the game properly for black. Queen d4, for example, if queen d4 guarding the pawn, then white can deliver queen f8 check, and then you have to go back with queen to g7. So instead, black sacrifices the pawn with rook to d3. With rook to c3, and Magnus immediately captures it. Rook captures on e3, now rook captures on c4, and now rook f3. So you cannot move the queen away from the defense of the h8 square, as then queen to h8 is coming, and this is checkmate. So here the problem is you have to play something like rook to c2 check and start checking the white king. However, Vasyl played queen to g7, and now it's actually game over for poor Chucky. But feel free to pause the video and try to find the win for Magnus here while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting either rook to f7 or even more straightforward rook to f8, because this will just be a game over. The king has nowhere to go, and well, after this you're just getting checkmated. For example, if this check comes, you can just go king h3. There's nothing to continue here, and the rook to h8 is coming. That's game over. However, Magnus misses this, and Magnus plays queen to e3 check. Incredible as it is. King to h7, and now queen to e6 by Magnus. Just attacking the rook here on c4. We have rook to c2 with check. Rook to c2 with check. If you try something like queen to d4 now, then queen to f7 check, king to h6, queen to f8 check, and king to g7. So this will hold for black. So instead, we have rook to c2 check. We have now king to h3, and now king to h6. Again, very, very unpleasant for black. Magnus goes queen to e3 check, king h7, and now, of course, queen to e8. Again, there is this possibility of rook to f8 on the next move, and there is no way to stop it. Chucky plays king to h6, and now rook to f8 again. The same idea wins the game, but Magnus again misses it. Magnus plays queen to e3 check again. We have king to h7, and now Magnus obviously didn't want to repeat the position, as he wanted to win the game now, but he played queen to b3. Now with a double attack here, but there also is a problem. It's not just a double attack, it's also this, and rook here is the idea. But now the game is completely lost for Magnus. So feel free to pause the video and win this game for Vasyl while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting the unstoppable mate. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it's queen to d7 check. And it was in this position on move 74 that Magnus Carlsen resigned the game. And here you see why Vasyl Ivanchuk is every world champion's worst nightmare. Point is that the king has nowhere to go, and once you play g4, it's just queen captures on g4 checkmate, and that is it. So really, really incredible stuff. Vasyl was better for the entire game. Magnus sacrificed this pawn for sort of a caveman approach, attacking maneuver, but Vasyl defended well, and then he was just better for the entire time. But then the clock situation stepped in, and then Magnus was better, and then he had a completely winning position. But in the end, Chucky is the one who emerged victorious. So quite a thriller already in round one. I can't wait to see what happens next. So let's check it out and enjoy that as well. I would like to thank Ben Edwards, Adam Gepfert, Henrik Håkansson, Tom Haythornthwaite, and Rainer Gibbons for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the Magnus Invitational. Not Magnus Invitational, the Chess24 Legends of Chess, checking up on your wonderful suggestions and whatever else happens in the chess world. Thank you all, I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your Saturday.